Today is Lesson 4 of our discussion series entitled Why Bother with Prayer. For the first two discussions of the series, we explored Judges chapter 13 verses 1 through 25. The central question of those two lessons was, why should I bother with prayer? But the question we began to ask in our last discussion and will continue exploring today is, why must I bother with prayer? As we discussed last time, when we speak about prayer in the church, we often speak about it in very pious and positive terms. Some prayers, however, in the First Testament were more like complaints, accusations, or even requests for the destruction of others. As we've already begun to see, the two prayers of Jeremiah that we've been studying are of these sort. Why study these sorts of prayers in the context of the prophet Jeremiah? We could study these types of prayers in the Psalms, for instance. But Jeremiah provides us with a life and ministry context out of which these particular prayers were uttered. It seems to me that such a context is a more helpful place from which to ask what it is that these more negative and aggressive forms of communication with God can help us to understand about our need for prayer. I believe that these two prayers of Jeremiah highlight at least 4 reasons for which God's people need prayer. We discussed the first 2 of those reasons last time. In that context, I suggested that we must pray because we need to be honest before God, and we must pray because we are often helpless to transform our situations by our own efforts alone. Now, many in our culture seem to presume that only simpletons believe in the real activity of God, the real justice of God, the real involvement of God in our world and in our lives. The great difficulty then for Jeremiah is that he was such a simpleton. That is, he was the man many today would call a fool. He did believe that God could act, that God had acted, and that God should be acting. Jeremiah's prayers were not prayed out of faithlessness. His true despair, his true angst, was precipitated by his faith, by his belief in Yahweh, the God of Israel. We considered most of Jeremiah's first prayer in our last discussion, but we'll begin today with the final words of that prayer. Just to situate ourselves in the context, I will read the entirety of Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 7 through 13. Jeremiah chapter 20, beginning in verse 7. You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. But if I say I will not mention his word, or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I'm weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. I hear many whispering, terror on every side. Denounce him, let's denounce him. All my friends are waiting for me to slip, saying, perhaps he will be deceived. Then we will prevail over him and take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior, so my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will fail and be thoroughly disgraced. Their dishonor will never be forgotten. Lord Almighty, you who examine the righteous and probe the heart and mind, let me see your vengeance on them, for to you I have committed my cause. Sing to the Lord, give praise to the Lord. He rescues the life of the needy from the hands of the wicked. So as we've been saying, our last discussion focused on verses 7 through 12. So it is verse 13 that we're looking at particularly now. It seems a bit out of place, doesn't it? Jeremiah had been commissioned and appointed by God to deliver a message of defeat to the people of the southern Israelite kingdom of Judah. He had been preaching more or less that the nation was about to be destroyed by the Babylonian Empire because of their recurrent failure to keep the covenant God had made with them at Mount Sinai. Therefore, according to Jeremiah, faithful followers of God should not defend their homes, their land, or their capital. Faithful followers of God should have surrendered to the Babylonians and allowed them to come in and take possession of all they had without a fight. And so perhaps it goes without saying that Jeremiah was not popular among his peers. So in this prayer, Jeremiah came honestly before God, accused God both of forcibly compelling him to preach these words and of sitting back and allowing Jeremiah's enemies to accost and abuse him. But in spite of this reality, Jeremiah remained hopeful that God's justice would come in the end, and he prayed for that justice in verses 11 through 12. And that brings us to verse 13. What might we have expected Jeremiah to have prayed in conclusion? As far as we know, Jeremiah's situation had not yet changed. He was still under assault. He was still preaching these words of violence and treachery, and the justice of God was still yet to be seen. Nonetheless, he ended this prayer in praise of God. Consider the words of verse 13 again. Sing to the Lord. Give praise to the Lord. He rescues the life of the needy from the hands of the wicked. Jeremiah praised God for acts that were consistent with what God had done in the past, but were not yet part of what God was doing in his present. Sing? Seriously? Sing in the midst of persecution? Sing while experiencing the absence of God during times of our own suffering? Sing while God's people reject the words of his prophet and guarantee their own destruction? Praise God? Hasn't Jeremiah just accused God of forcibly pushing him into a pointless call that has caused him nothing but torture and torment? And now he calls on all who hear his words to praise this God? Jeremiah has been anything but rescued from the hands of the wicked. The context tells us that he was in the grasp of the wicked when he prayed these prayers. Yet he testified to God's faithfulness anyway, in song, in praise, and in confession of who he believed God to be despite his experience. Jeremiah prayed because he needed to express a trust that his own experience was decrying. And that's the third reason that God's people need to pray that we find in the example of Jeremiah. We must pray because we need to express a trust that experience oftentimes decries. Pain, hurt, bitterness, resentment, and all other experiences that flow out of tragic and overwhelming circumstances can fester in the human heart. These experiences oftentimes threaten to demolish our faith and drive us away from our trust in God. We must pray in these moments as Jeremiah did, to give voice to a trust in God that our experiences are threatening to snatch away from us. There's a passage in C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters that I believe helps to illustrate the power of this type of prayer. I quoted from this book in our last discussion, but by way of reminder, The Screwtape Letters is a fictional series of letters written from a senior demon to a lesser demon, advising him on how best to keep humans away from a relationship with God. The quotation I'm about to read comes from chapter 8 of the book, and again it's written by a demon named Screwtape to his young apprentice, Wormwood. Screwtape writes, "Humans are amphibians, half spirit and half animal. The enemy's determination to produce such a revolting hybrid was one of the things that determined our father to withdraw his support from him. As spirits, they belong to the eternal world, but as animals, they inhabit time. This means that while their spirit can be directed to an eternal object, their bodies, passions, and imaginations are in continual change, for to be in time means to change. Their nearest approach to constancy, therefore, is undulation, the repeated return to a level from which they repeatedly fall back, a series of troughs and peaks. As long as he lives on earth, periods of emotional and bodily richness and liveliness will alternate with periods of numbness and poverty. To decide what the best use of it is, you must ask what use the enemy wants to make of it, and then do the opposite. Now, it may surprise you to learn that in his efforts to get permanent possession of a soul, he relies on the troughs even more than on the peaks. Some of his special favorites have gone through longer and deeper troughs than anyone else. The reason is this: one must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, creatures whose life on its miniature scale will be qualitatively like his own, not because he has absorbed them, but because their wills freely conform to his. We want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below has drawn all other beings into himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings united to him, but still distinct. And that is where the troughs come in. You must have often wondered why the enemy does not make more use of his power to be sensibly present to human souls in any degree he chooses and at any moment. But you now see that the irresistible and indisputable are the two weapons which the very nature of his scheme forbids him to use. Merely to override a human will, as his felt presence in any but the faintest and most mitigated degree would certainly do, would be for him useless. He cannot ravish, he can only woo, for his ignoble idea is to eat the cake and have it. The creatures are to be one with him, but yet themselves. Merely to cancel them or assimilate them will not serve. He's prepared to do a little overriding at the beginning, but he never allows this state of affairs to last long. Sooner or later he withdraws, if not in fact, at least from their conscious experience, all those supports and incentives. He leaves the creature to stand up on its own legs, to carry out from the will alone duties which have lost all relish. It is during such trough periods, much more than during the peak periods, that it is growing into the sort of creature he wants it to be. Hence the prayers offered in the state of dryness are those which please him best. We can drag our patients along by continual tempting, because we design them only for the table, and the more their will is interfered with, the better. He cannot tempt to virtue as we do to vice. He wants them to learn to walk, and must therefore take away his hand. And if only the will to walk is really there, he's pleased even with their stumbles. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. That's the end of the quotation. Obviously, Lewis has constructed a fictional world and a fictional conversation, but I think he's articulated a powerful truth that seems to be at the heart of this prayer of Jeremiah. Oftentimes we expect that following Jesus and being the people that God wants us to be should be a better way of life, perhaps even an easier way of life than the alternatives. While growing up, I certainly heard that real happiness, real contentment were things that only Christians could truly experience. I was taught that though non-believers may have money, toys, and pleasures of various kinds, there is a hole in the center of them that will place a sourness or a bitterness in their mouths, no matter how sweet or savory their food may be. If this world were not so full of sin, and if the very fabric of culture, society, family, and the individual together weren't so saturated with rebellion against God, then perhaps what I had been told as a child might have proven to be true more consistently. But given the state of things in the world, following God often is challenging and unsettling, sometimes even more challenging and unsettling than not following and not believing. Evil itself, particularly when we must endure experiences that overwhelm us, invites us to question whether what we have believed is in fact the truth. Jeremiah did not find peace and contentment in his life with God, but he believed in God's future nonetheless. Because experiences, at one time or another, have always threatened to shipwreck the faith of God's people, we must sometimes confess what we believe the truth about God to be, when all the evidence of our lives seem to be saying otherwise. We need to confess what the prophets and apostles have confessed the truth to be, especially when our experience is beginning to convince us that they were wrong about God somehow. We need to pray, because we need to tell God who we need him to be, who we believe him to be, when the circumstances of our lives are telling us that any such prayer is a waste of breath. We must pray because we need to express a trust that experience oftentimes decries. And Jeremiah did just that. He sang God's praises and confessed God to be the Savior he needed him to be. But as the second of his prayers would quickly make clear, his was a prayer of faith, not experience. Continue following along with me as I read from Jeremiah chapter 20, now in verses 14 through 18. Jeremiah said, "Cursed be the day I was born. May the day my mother bore me not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought my father the news, who made him very glad, saying, 'A child is born to you, a son.' May that man be like the towns the Lord overthrew without pity. May he hear wailing in the morning, a battle cry at noon. For he did not kill me in the womb, with my mother as my grave, her womb enlarged forever. Why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow, and to end my days in shame?" If verse 13 made us believe that Jeremiah would conclude his prayer time on a high note of praise, we would have misjudged him. Despite his confession of what he believed the truth to be about God, Jeremiah still seems to have wished that he had never been born. In the end, he longed to have been a stillborn child who had been killed in the womb. Even his faith in God could not eradicate the intensity of Jeremiah's suffering. Some commentators have suggested that Jeremiah may have been emotionally unstable, and therefore that perhaps we should not read these prayers as models of prayer for the people of God, but rather as the aggressive ramblings of a man driven mad by his service to God. However, there is indication in the text here that Jeremiah had not lost control of himself, nor had he stepped beyond the bounds of prayer that God has permitted to his people. In these verses, Jeremiah cursed two things: the day he was born, and the man who brought his father the news. But more interesting is what Jeremiah did not curse. He did not curse God, nor did he curse his parents. Why is that important? Perhaps because cursing either of those persons would have been a violation of the covenant of Sinai and a sin under the law of Moses. Under the covenant God made with Israel, to curse God was blasphemy, and to curse one's parents was a violation of the commandment to honor them. Even in Jeremiah's most expressive curse, in which he wishes he were aborted or stillborn, he steers clear of violating Torah. Honesty is never an occasion for blasphemy. Even prayers of lament and curse must be expressed in the context of faithfulness. Even in praying that he had never been, Jeremiah refused to rebel against God. So often in our culture, we use times of emotional distress or tragedy to excuse belligerent sinfulness. Jeremiah is an example of a person who did not allow the difficulty of his circumstances to be an occasion for disobedience. He prayed in honesty, but he also prayed in faithfulness. And that's the fourth reason that God's people need prayer that I believe we find in the example of Jeremiah. We must pray because we need to demonstrate our faithfulness, even in the throes of deepest despair. Praying in these moments, and praying without sin in these moments, will strengthen us in ways that we cannot calculate, if the rest of Jeremiah's ministry is meant to show us where he went from here. Because all true prayer proceeds from faithfulness and trust, we must remain submitted to God in prayer even in times of darkest despair and emotional turmoil. And in these moments and in this way, we need to pray. In the movie version of The Count of Monte Cristo, which stars Jim Caviezel as Edmond Dantes, Dantes cries out at one poignant point of the narrative, "Don't rob me of my hate. It's all that I have." Can you look back at experiences in your life and feel the power of those words, especially in situations in which you felt helpless or victimized? I can. For me, the hate feels like a refusal to accept the evil done to me. It feels powerful when at the time I felt helpless. Have you had that experience as well? It may not be hate or rage. It may be bitterness or resentment or whatever other unchristlike sentiments we have harbored as a way of steeling ourselves against our vulnerabilities. I've heard many times, and I'm sure you have as well, that we must give these things to God. But what does that mean? I think in the context of the prayers of Jeremiah, it means we must say them to God. We must pray them to God. As Jeremiah has modeled for us, we must be honest with God about what has happened to us and how those things have made us feel, including how they've made us feel about God. We need to permit ourselves to be transparent with God and confess, as Jeremiah did, that my anger, my hate, my bitterness, my resentment did not protect me then, and I know it will not protect me in the future. With Jeremiah, I must confess that God was and is my only hope, because I'm often helpless to transform my situations by my own efforts alone. And if I feel God has let me down in those moments, then God has invited me to tell him that honestly. And with Jeremiah, I need to confess the God that I believe God to be, and the God that I need God to be for me. And whatever my emotions may be, even if, like Jeremiah, I've been so overwhelmed and so abused that I could wish never to have been born at all, I need to voice them to God in prayer. But I need to do it not in a sinful way in which I allow my honesty to justify sinfulness and rebellion, cursing at God, for instance. Like Jeremiah, I must evidence my willingness to submit to God even in the throes of my darkest emotions and feelings. And then, like Jeremiah, I must not walk away. I must still believe and still obey. Then perhaps the words of C.S. Lewis in The Mouth of Screwtape will be true of me. He said, "Our cause, the cause of the evil one, is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys." To study Jeremiah is to study some dark stuff and to encounter a shadowy side of following Jesus and believing in God that Christians don't often talk about in polite conversation. However, I hope you're beginning to see, as I've begun to realize, that because life is sometimes painful and sometimes disappointing, even life with God, then if our faith is to survive these experiences, there is no value in concealing our feelings from God. As much as prayer is for praising God, and for worshiping God, and for making requests of God, Jeremiah has suggested that it is also for transparently communicating ourselves to God. We need to speak to God frankly, hopefully, and righteously in these moments. So again, I encourage you, whatever your experience may be, please, will you pray?